Today's topic is about sexual and asexual reproduction. First of all, let's talk about what reproduction is. Reproduction is the process by which organisms produce more organisms like themselves. I think everyone knows that. And this is when organisms pass genetic information to their offspring during reproduction. Let's talk specifically about asexual reproduction. Okay, asexual reproduction is the creation of genetically identical offspring from one parent. If it's from one parent, you've got to think about it. That's only one organism's DNA, so of course the offspring are going to be genetically identical because you do not have a mix of DNA. There are several types of asexual reproduction. We have binary fission, we have budding, vegetative propagation, fragmentation, and mitosis is also an example of asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction occurs mostly in prokaryotic cells. There are other forms of life that go through asexual reproduction too, but it's mostly in prokaryotic cells. Remember that prokaryotic cells are cells that do not have a nucleus, they do not have all the organelles. These are things like bacteria. So let's talk about binary fission first of all. Binary fission is when a single celled organism splits into two equal parts. It occurs in prokaryotes only. Bacteria, yeast, and some algae. Okay, and if you can look at the picture here, we have the parent cell. We duplicate our DNA. The cell begins to divide, and the daughter cells split. So if you'll notice that binary fission is a much simpler process than mitosis because all you have to copy is the DNA, whereas in mitosis you have to copy all of the DNA and the cellular organelles. Okay, let's go on to budding. Budding is when small projections grow on the surface of a parent and forms a new organism. Okay, that picture there is what you call a hydra, and if you look at the sides of its body, you see those two projections right there? Well, both of those are going to actually turn into another organism. They're going to turn into a hydra. So they actually have organisms that develop on the outside of their body. Okay. Let's go to vegetative propagation. That is when a stem of a parent grows into a new organism. For example, my grandmother, she always gives me pieces of her plants to put in my yard, and they actually turn into a completely new plant. That's vegetative propagation. And then fragmentation is when a parent splits into pieces that can each be grown into a new organism. Let me show you a little bit more about fragmentation. One organism that goes through fragmentation is what we call it's a type of flatworm called a planarian. Looks a little bit like this. Well, what happens is that if you cut a planarian into pieces like this, the head would form a middle and a tail. The middle would actually form a head and a tail, and the tail would form a middle and a head. Okay. What are some advantages of asexual reproduction? Well, asexual reproduction doesn't have to rely on outside forces. Example, pollen has to rely on water and wind. Okay, things that reproduce sexually have to rely on finding a mate. Asexual reproducers do not have to worry about that. Asexual reproduction is very rapid, and it's actually more efficient. There are not as many things that can go wrong with asexual reproduction. Now let's think about what the disadvantages of asexual reproduction would be. If everything reproduced asexually, then we would have a major problem because it says all organisms respond same way to the environment because they are just alike. There wouldn't be any, different immune systems. Everything would be the same. There would be no survival of the fittest. It says organisms may lack the ability to adapt in order to survive changing conditions. Okay, now let's go to sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when two parent cells can be joined to form a new individual. Offspring are genetically different than parents, and it occurs in most eukaryotes. Sexual reproduction is not just sex. It doesn't have to require intercourse in all organisms. It is any time there is a male and female gamete involved that is still considered asexual reproduction, even if they don't come in contact. Think about plants. Plants release pollen to the air. Pollen is essentially plant sperm, and the pollen lands on something and fertilizes an egg in another plant. So that is sexual reproduction. So here's a comparison of the two. Asexual reproduction requires one parent. It's mostly in prokaryotes. Offspring are identical to the parent. Sexual reproduction requires two parents. It's mostly in eukaryotes, and offspring are different than the parent. Okay, another thing about sexual reproduction, the process of meiosis would be sexual because we actually do get gametes that are very different from each other. And the disadvantages or the advantages of sexual reproduction is that at least you're creating organisms that are different from one another. So let's go over our questions that we were working on. Okay, the first question says, in asexual reproduction, blank organisms can produce other organisms. So the answer there, of course, is one. One organism can produce other organisms. Number two examples of asexual reproduction. Well, we talked about 4 or 5 of them. You can choose any 2 that you want, but that would be budding, and let's put fragmentation. Remember that you could have also put binary fission and vegetative propagation, and then also mitosis. Okay, number 3, what is an advantage of asexual reproduction? Well, remember we talked about asexual reproduction being quick, and that it doesn't rely on outside forces like the wind or the water or actually having to find a mate. Okay, 4. What is a disadvantage of asexual reproduction? The disadvantage of asexual reproduction is that all organisms are genetically identical. And that is definitely a disadvantage because, like I said before, there's no survival of the fittest. Everything has the same immune system, same abilities. So all organisms are identical. Okay, number 5. In sexual reproduction, blank parents must be involved. The answer is 2. Okay, and then in number 6, what is an advantage of sexual reproduction? I would say that it creates genetically diverse organisms. Sorry. Okay, that concludes our lesson on sexual and asexual reproduction.